So good to be here. Seems like a fitting beginning to the start of my time here. Sort of the beginning of my 20-minute work week. So we're jumping into the middle of a story here, which is an odd thing always to be jumping, right? Here we are in Acts, and all of a sudden then they journeyed. So who's they and where were they, right? But of course, that's what we're doing also together this morning. We're jumping into the middle of a story. That you guys have your own story, the story of Morgantown Church of the Brethren. And of course, individually, you have your own stories of how it is you got here and where you've been and where it is you think you're going. And Deb and I, we have our own stories too of where we've been and where we're going. And somehow, we're just going to jump into the middle of this together. So it seems to work to jump into the middle of this story and think about, to use this passage to think about journeying together. And we're hopefully going somewhere. And so this story is actually a good place to think about that. So I want to pull out, because this is a sermon, I have to pull out three themes from this passage. And the first thing I want us to notice is how much this is a Spirit-guided journey. That this isn't just, well, they just decided to do this, and well, they kind of just did this, they did this, and stuff happens. This isn't a stuff happens kind of story. This is the Spirit guided them sort of story. And I'm hoping also that the story of Morgantown Church to this point has been the Spirit guided them sort of story. And I also really hope that as the story continues, that this continues to be the Spirit guided them sort of story. And of course, when I say that, it's sort of one of these motherhood and apple pie kinds of issues. Everyone goes, oh yes, of course, this is going to be a Spirit-guided sort of story. But it's not that simple. And even, right, I mean, the good thing about this for me is that even in the Bible, it's not that simple. That the book of Acts is written by the same person who wrote the Gospel of Luke. And he wants to say this over and over again. The Spirit did this, and the Spirit did this, and it's all guided by the Holy Spirit. Over and over and over he says this. But he leaves out a lot. Right? So they were traveling along, and the Spirit didn't allow them to go somewhere. How did they know that? Did the Spirit just come like with a big stop sign? Standing in the middle of the road? Or, like later on, Paul has a vision, but does he have a lot of visions, or is someone else having visions? How do they know that? Because that would be really nice, right? And Acts does this consistently. Oh, the Spirit did this. How? And this is going to be, obviously, a continuing discussion for the rest of human history. Right? How do we know for sure that this is the way God guides us? And there's nothing simple about this, right? I mean, occasionally, right, there's visions, but it isn't, it just isn't that straightforward. And even when they have a vision, it's not straightforward, right? So Paul has this vision, and the man from Macedonia says, "Come and help us," right? So they get on the next flight and they head over to Macedonia. Right? And they get to Macedonia and they book themselves into the first holiday and they find. And so they take these, rickety boats over the water and they end up in Philippi. And the most natural thing for Paul to do would be to find a Jewish group. So in ancient cities, people lived in clusters. They lived in ghettos. Right? So the Jewish people all lived in this part of the city, right? And the people from this part of the world lived in this part of the city. They lived in groups. So normally you could walk into a town, and if you were Jewish, you could say, "Hey, does anyone know if there's any Jews in this town?" And somebody might say, "Oh yeah, all the Jews, they live in this region." And then you wander your way through town until you got to there, and then someone would take you in. But the fact is, right, that if you read the story, they don't seem to have found any Jews there, right? Because it says on Sabbath day in verse 13, we went outside the gate by the river where we supposed there was a place of prayer. So there was no Jews to guide them. There was no synagogue. Synagogue just means gathering. So there was no official Jewish gathering. They just sort of were guessing. Right? So the Holy Spirit, the man from Macedonia vision happened, and then the Holy Spirit guided them there, and then they found nothing. And instead of finding the man from Macedonia waiting for them, they found a group of women. Where's this man from Macedonia? Don't know. Right? So you go there, and the Holy Spirit says, this is what's going to happen, and then that happens instead. Right? No man from Macedonia, just the women from Macedonia. And in fact, not even women from Macedonia. Lydia is from Thyatira, and Thyatira is in Asia, which is just where they had been forbidden to go. The Holy Spirit says, oh no, don't go to Asia. Instead, go to Macedonia and speak to the woman from Asia there. Right? So there's nothing simple, there's nothing straightforward about this. Well, we're just going to follow the Holy Spirit and do what the Holy Spirit says. And everyone goes, oh yes, that's what we'll do. Right? And we will. Right? We will try to do that together on this journey. But if you think that's going to solve all of our problems, you haven't been paying attention, I think. So that's the first point. The second point is this very subtle mentions of empire in this text. Right? And in some ways, it's always there in these stories. Because Paul is journeying through what used to be the Greek Empire and then became the Roman Empire. And all of this is possible because of empire. And what's even more interesting is that all of this is possible because of a man from Macedonia. Right? If you know your history a little bit, you know that the Greek Empire was started by a man from Macedonia whose name was Alexander, who we know as Alexander the Great. Right? My wife is smiling because I'm actually mentioning a historical point in sermon. I promise not to do that very often. Right? Right? So we hear about the man from Macedonia saying, oh, come and help us, which is really ironic considering it was a man from Macedonia who went and conquered the world and everybody needed help to escape from him. Right? So there's these little mentions of empire. And I'm sure that, as people in the first century read this and they read man from Macedonia, they immediately went to, Alexander in their heads and going, well, it's really ironic that a man from Macedonia is asking help from this Paul person. Right? And so this whole thing, this whole journey of Paul's is possible because of a man from Macedonia. Right? Empire makes this possible. The great Roman peace makes this possible. He can go so many different places, anywhere along anywhere on the Mediterranean coast at all, and get by in Greek, which is probably his first language anyway, right? And otherwise, there would be a different language every 5 miles he traveled. Right? So when the first missionaries went to Ghana, the first thing they did is learn the language. Right? Paul is popping around, and he stays 6 weeks here and 3 weeks there, maybe like a whole year and a half somewhere, but he doesn't have to learn the language because everyone's working in Greek to some extent anyway. Right? So this is all possible because of empire, and yet, empire is not Paul's friend in other ways. Empire is also, the organization that beats Paul and stones him and shipwrecks him and ultimately beheads him. Empire is the empire that put Jesus to death. So there's this very difficult relationship with empire. Again, not straightforward. And this, too, of course, is our reality here in West Virginia. That we live in the midst of empire. And to some extent, our gathering this morning is possible because of empire. Empire says, yes, there should be places of worship. Empire says, oh, places of worship don't even have to pay taxes. An empire says, oh, preachers get a special tax rate. Did you know that? I get a special tax rate. I get tax breaks that the rest of you don't get. Right? An empire makes all of this possible, right, at the same time that empire is sending drones to various parts of Yemen and places we couldn't even find on a map to drop bombs on people we've never met and have no idea exactly who they are, and they're going to die today because of empire, because of your and my tax dollars. And so we exist in this odd relationship to the empire that we're sitting in the middle of. And we can't focus on empire, but we can't forget it either. Right? And the New Testament doesn't either, all the way through here, right? And even when it mentions Philippi, Philippi happens to be a Roman colony, and this mattered. Right? This mattered because it actually changed tax rates in Philippi. Philippi paid less taxes because it was a Roman colony. It also meant, of course, it had to set up certain kinds of temples and worship certain kinds of gods, including Caesar. Caesar was worshipped as a god in Philippi. We're not quite used to that, but we are quite used to pledging allegiance to a piece of cloth, which is, another odd sort of thing. So that's our second lesson from this. The third one comes sort of out of verse 10. So verse 10 says, when he had seen the vision, we immediately tried to cross over to Macedonia, being convinced that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. So there's the vision, but then he also says, being convinced. The vision wasn't enough. They still had to figure out what to do with the vision. And that's something that I don't know yet, is how do you guys make decisions? We, for the last 20 years, Deb and I have been part of a church in Kansas where we used a modified consensus system to make decisions. And the basic idea behind it was that God was not going to say something to you and then something else to you, because God isn't a God of confusion. God is a God of order. So if we're really listening to God, we should all come to the same conclusion. And that's hard. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. On the other hand, for the last 2 years, in our time in Ghana, decisions were made by the pastor. That was a nice, simple system. The pastor stood up here and said, this is what we're going to do. Everybody said, yes, sir. Not that they did it. They all said, yes, sir.
We can do that.
Yeah, you can do that too. Which has its own dysfunction to it. Right? And so we've seen, right, in our history, two very different ways of discerning how God is working. Right? Discerning the Holy Spirit, discerning where we're going. Right? Because we are going somewhere. Right? My job here is not institutional maintenance. Right? We want to be going somewhere together, but we have to figure this out. And so I'm looking forward to finding out from you how it is you make decisions. And especially, right, if we get to the point where there's a few more people in these pews, how do we incorporate other people into the decision-making process? How do we make it their church rather than just our church with visitors? Right, and that gets trickier as churches change, right? People leave, people come, and how do we do this together? So those are our 3 points this morning. One of the things you will discover as you listen to me more often is that I'm really bad at conclusions. And I worked really hard this week on my conclusion, and I still don't have one. But I think, right, that this is also sort of the way life is. Conclusions are tricky, and stuff never ends. Right? And I'm hoping that when my sermon is over, you don't go, oh, that was nice, and you continue on with your lives just exactly the way they were before, because otherwise it was just entertaining. so excited to start. I'm going to try really hard not to make a lot of changes at the beginning because you guys need to rest right